Intellectual property concerns are at the forefront of many debates and legislative efforts at the moment. There are two reasons for it. The first one is economic. People try to work out how do we share and partake in knowledge and its results in a sustainable way in the world of the 21st century. How do we do that in the fairly new system of intellectual resources value, given that we are still struggling to do so in a much older system of resources that are standard trades and goods? The second is cultural. Many lawmakers are trying to figure out how do we tighten intellectual properties legislation so that we can put an end to intellectual trespassing while still preserving the freedom of access to information that the internet and globalization are giving us as a society. How do we cut this Gordian knot? The problem is that they are trying to meet the challenges and demands of our time by applying a system that was made in the past, with knowledge and resources of the past, for problems of the past. And in the process, they are alienating from the law millions of people who don't see this outdated intellectual ownership model aligning with their values and concepts of intellectual property in the current era of exponential growth. We are forgetting the origins of that system and its socioeconomic and demographic context. By doing so, we are limiting and alienating an ever-increasing population from the current exponential evolution of discoveries and ideas that composes the world's intellectual patrimony of today. We are better off having a system to protect our intellectual heritage than not, but we have to ask ourselves what is more important for us to preserve, particularly when that system marginalizes so many in our society and ultimately hampers the very thing it was made to protect. The problem is that the current system of intellectual property was designed and is based on values from a different age. It was conceived in the monopoly era of imperialistic England and in the economic interests of its empire. Before the arrival of the printing press, there was no system of intellectual property. Not really. I mean, you could only physically multiply a work by the highly laborious and error-prone process of having scribes manually do it. This made censorship very easy to accomplish, but a cheap and fast reproduction process of written works, accessible to the masses and free of control, that was a revolutionary change. And many people embraced this opportunity, thinking that copyrights was not a right of man at all, but more the opposite of a prior right established by the author's work of creation. This was strongly opposed by the London copy-owning elite, which laid claim to all works that had ever been printed by them. Thus, copyright was invented in 18th century Britain. So it's also built into it the whole idea of creating scarcity and of controlling knowledge. Copyrights were given by the Crown as privileges to a select few and were called monopolies. Ideas are not naturally scarce. However, as American intellectual property lawyer and author Stephan Kinsella expressed, by recognizing a right in an ideal object, one creates scarcity where none existed before. Property rights are not applicable to things of infinite abundance because there cannot be conflict over such things. The printers, not the authors, were the recipients of the royalties from these monopolies. The idea of protecting the authors came much later. This also increased the hold of censorship, as rights of printing could be withheld from unwanted works. By claiming ownership over ideas, the printers of the time were doing nothing different than the empire claiming rights to lands of foreign countries. They were appropriating knowledge to control it and benefit selfishly from it. And the consequence of doing so is that the core idea of protection of intellectual work and ideas has been perverted into a system of control and appropriation of intellectual patrimony because it has been handed to monopolistic entities from its original design. We have put forward so intensely the protection of individuals' intellectual claims over the rights of the many that we now have companies, which corporate personhood considers as individuals, buying out and filing copyrights, trademarks, and patterns en masse. This is done not to protect their inventions and creations, but to appropriate parcels of the intellectual frontier, like lands to be claimed as their own if they ever need them, or to collect rights when others do. Like the controversial Rockstar Consortium, leaguing forces of giants such as Apple Inc., BlackBerry, Ericsson, Microsoft, and Sony, to troll and bully other giants, the likes of Google and Samsung, into paying them patent rights. By giving a claimant the right to own intellectual property in the same way as a part of land with the same ownership rights as over other man-made items, we are giving lots of vested power to the owners of rights who have capital to back it up. The threat of being sued for infringement is often greater than having to pay the royalties, or sometimes to uncover the truth of ownership if the ownership is questionable. A good example of the monopoly that rights owners with capital can exert is the Happy Birthday song. It was created by Mildred Hill and her sister Patty in the 1900s. Warner Brothers got the rights and collected approximately $2 million in royalties a year for it. They extended the copyright coverage, claiming it ended in the year 2030 rather than it already being expired for a few years. It was generally known that the copyright had expired, but was considered too costly and complicated to challenge Warner's claim in court versus paying them royalties. Intellectual ownership effectively attributes ideas and creations out of the ether to one individual over the well-being of the multitude. As the number of individuals staking claims keeps ever increasing, IP systems of monopolies over ideas and creations multiplies exponentially the rate of intellectual trespassing. We are effectively creating a nightmare of intellectual tangle that only prevents us as a society to move forward at the intellectual speed we can muster as a species working together to achieve greater goals. Because of the many ramifications of our IP system, companies the like of Monsanto have made it a business strategy to sue out of business competitors and even consumers that are not using their crops. As a matter of fact, it has sued about one farmer every 3 weeks for 16 straight years, often relying on their ability to throw more money at court fees than the single individual defending against them. The established system of intellectual property doesn't serve the individual artists as it's hyped up to do, but instead serves the interest of the few titles in big corporations' portfolios that continually profit over the passing years. When much of other creations are short-lived and stop being profitable for their maker or rights owner after a few years, corporations are lobbying to extend copyright duration to squeeze every last drop of the few rights that continue to bring in money over the years. The extension of such rights into corporate hands is far from serving the greater populace, because even when companies stop distributing books or song catalogs, they can prevent another from doing so, and hence threaten our intellectual patrimony to be lost from inability to share and preserve these creations and cumulative human knowledge. The BBC and other preservation museums and entities often run into those IP rights barriers when attempting to preserve the world's capital of different arts, songs, books, or video archives. And with the constant expansion and cumulative lawmaking and enforcing of IP laws, this process becomes harder and harder as the need for it and the multiplication of intellectual riches becomes exponentially bigger and bigger. The corporations like Rockstar Consortium are stockpiling patterns and copyrights to not only avoid patents trolling on their operations, but also to troll in return. Under this mentality of scarcity, they are enforcing protection of their portfolio of intellectual properties as a business strategy, without thinking about the impact on the access to knowledge and copyrighted art and ideas. By letting individuals, and mostly corporations acting as a person, buy out and claim for their own letters of the alphabet, numbers, colors, physical gestures, and historical public speeches, we are letting them acquire the building blocks of creativity and inventiveness of our society. This is creating a mentality of scarcity in which the resources which have infinite permutations and combinations possible suddenly become limited and restrained by intellectual ownership. Why should we leave as a private property to the heirs of Martin Luther King Jr. the rights to determine if the "I have a dream" speech should be seen or not? After all, that speech was given in public in front of thousands of individuals and went on to influence the lives of millions in U.S. history. We are being told by John Deere that we cannot repair our own tractors that we bought because we paid for it, but we don't own the right to tamper and repair it because we only received an implied license for the life of the vehicle to operate the vehicle. How can it be considered acceptable for an individual or corporation to own a letter when the Roman alphabet counts 26 and the longest alphabet counts no more than 74, and there are 7.4 billion individuals on this planet using the same letters? It is a mentality that is profiting more and more big corporations and defends their interests by disregarding the ones of the many. The sharing of knowledge is part of the ecosystem of social evolution and the exponential growth of populace that brings about new ideas and inventions. If you think of it, the human culture, and I don't say this is exclusive to culture, I think it is also true of sciences and innovations. I address culture specifically because it is the primary casualty of this mindset. Limiting the access to the building blocks of creativity transforms our culture from a read and write to a read-only one, when we should be doing the exact opposite and awakening people to express the creativity they have within themselves. Instead, the system we have is this. I think that we have an intellectual property system that was modeled on the interests of an imperialistic monopoly, and that it uses its same concepts of physical goods ownership centralization. The intellectual property model has been treated on par with physical property, utilizing the same concepts of ownership, rights, infringements, and trespassing that Imperial Britain used to enforce its monopoly. They originate from the same basic ideas which favor a monopoly of resources and control of cost and supply by creating artificial scarcity. With Earth's ever-increasing population attributing parts of our intellectual heritage to individuals, an increasing part being companies, corporations, or consortiums collecting intellectual ownerships, it is becoming an absurd proposition as we are nearing 7.5 billion. Nothing is created from scratch. Everything is based on pre-existing ideas. The ideas and technologies that drive our society's evolution all stand on the back of previous ones. And these ideas are not originally scarce. They become so when we decide to throttle access to them. A blossoming of culture is created by the individual members of society having access to knowledge, ideas, and intellectual resources. The genesis for great inventions and great arts comes from exposure to other great inventions and arts, not from thin air. What created the creative output of the Enlightenments was the proximity and inter-influence of many creators, thinkers, and artists building upon the sum of each other's input, not as individual units that just happen to live in the same era. In contrary, censorship and limited access to knowledge got us the Dark Ages. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean to say that IP is a completely useless concept and that it should be abolished. But what I do say is that its unsound foundation on value no longer shared by the whole of human society of our current social world order makes the decisions and regulations based on this current model very dangerous and potentially having terrible repercussions in the long run on many strata of our civilization. In that scarcity system of IP, the basis for creation are limited and controlled by those who have staked their claims first and own royalties on everything deriving from that original claim. Our current system that is supposed to protect our intellectual heritage is instead threatening it. It is a continuation of colonialist centralization and control of money and knowledge, in which everything needs to be owed dues to the party which has staked claim to an intellectual land or frontier. In the words of visionary Elon Musk when he opened Tesla's patents, it serves merely to stifle progress, entrench the positions of giant corporations, and enrich those in the legal profession, rather than the actual inventors. The model is outdated and flawed at its origins. We have recognized this in the imperialist model for physical goods, but have yet to do the same for intellectual ownership. Now, with the advent of internet, the modern printing press, digitalization has become an issue. In the digital era, everything now is a copy of something, hence everything becomes subject to copyrights. The generations of today don't feel bound by these parameters anymore. The web has breached the frontier of intellectual ownership by allowing an exponential power of copying and reproducing that was unthinkable before. As the printing press did before, the World Wide Web has given us access to incredible technologies to create an hyper-connected world that allows exponential growth and sharing of our culture. Instead of preserving our intellectual riches and providing the creators and thinkers of all walks of life with better access to it, our current system of intellectual ownership is instead bogging down this process, often to protect the interests of big IP holding companies. As mainstream companies now prevent you from tampering under the hood of technologies they sell you at the same or higher prices than before, the public domain and open source movements have come up as a counterpoint to this dramatic increase in IP regulations. You have people coming up with things like the Arduino board, which is an electronics prototyping platform that is freely shared and accessed by makers and innovators around the world to create and build upon its base more ideas and inventions free from the hurdles of patenting laws. These movements empower readers of culture by allowing them to piece together the building blocks of culture to also become writers of their own. The big corporations that have become guardians of our intellectual patrimony by means of ownership should realize that culture is not just a top-down or downstream only, but instead an exchange across many sources and individual creators, allowing the exponential growth that we are capable of. Society and culture evolve at the speed of its intellectual and cultural development spreading. A good example is the ancient African concept of Ubuntu, known to most Linux adopters as the name of one of their main distributions. I am what I am because of who we all are. Indeed, Linux is what it is not only because of its initial creator, Linus Torvalds, but because he decided to share his work with millions of others, which in turn helped create this. The Linux operating system brings the spirit of Ubuntu to the world of computers. Here comes the concept of fair use, which is similar to a landowner allowing passage to a nearby city or a river to get water through his lands, because they are in the way of accessing them. You're not trying to gain or profit directly from passing through my lands, hence you are not impeding on my ownership rights directly. You're simply getting across them for another goal, which is, in this case, to get to town or the river. Fair use would grant you that passage right. The problem with this concept is that it considers the whole of creations and ideas as goods and properties to be owned and promoted for monetary gains. And this causes chaos in the management and regulation of IP. Not all creations are meant to make money. Some are meant to be appreciated or simply to be made only to be discarded after, just for the sake and pleasure of creating. For this, we have come up with creative licensing, like YouTube allowing mishmash of videos and music, but saying, we're going to put this ad on your video to compensate artists, or more generally, the corporation owning the rights, for you to use so that every time it is seen, they will get compensation. The trouble with this is that we're having something that was not originally made for profiting being capitalized upon for gains. It now pays the owners of the samples rights that were used for something that doesn't make money and was not meant to make money for its creator. If it was really meant to be a system that protects the creators or inventors, the creator of the new work would get a share of the profits as well, not just the original samples rights owners. Which, by the way, they rarely do as money gets tricked back up to the source. Many artists have complained that they don't see the gains generated by the millions of views some of their stuff receives as they get siphoned by intermediate parties before it reaches them. New ideas like the blockchain might solve these issues. Knowledge and its creations then become scarce and limited because it is in the hands of the few. And they are becoming fewer and fewer as corporations and consortiums are buying up and stockpiling the patents and copyrights as lands to be owned in a race to wealth and intellectual monopoly. If we want to evolve at the exponential speed we can as a species, we have to think beyond this colonialist construct of intellectual goods and see intellectual creations for what they are, our communal heritage. Not big estates to be owned by the few that can threaten individuals of trespassing at any moment they try dabbling into creative work. We still allow the holder of a patent to have monopoly on the distribution and on the design of the invention and the ones based on it. Why do we do that? To invent or create something nowadays, we've made it so that the plane of invention has to clear passing rights for every step of the way in every context possible, We are living today with the effect of a monopoly that took place during the British Empire expansionist era, and it has become entrenched in our modern conception of intellectual creations. We have to think differently about intellectual ownership. We have to learn to think beyond its outdated model and adopt one designed for an exponential society with exponential growth and interconnectivity. As Robert Fischel, holder of more than 200 patents in the U.S., puts it, the purpose of a patent is not to make the inventor wealthy, but instead is to reveal trade secrets so that commerce and technology advance. Secondly, we have to recognize that most of the great creations happen in group, that collaboration is the backbone of growth. And finally, that the product of the sum of human creation is made to benefit us all, not just the individual participating in the initial act. Maybe then the intellectual land ranchers that our institutions have become will start to see the concept of Ubuntu, as Nelson Mandela best described it. I need you in order to be me, and you need me in order to be you.